my exchanges with Hamad, something which came up was about how he was wondering how generally the kind of French reception to non-Western contemporary art is. So when I actually was sort of going back and looking at reviews of Indian Summer, I did come across references to, in fact, I mean, most of the reviews are mostly interested, but they were interesting from a sociological, anthropological point of view. They're relating it to those issues. It's interesting when I began thinking about it how little there is in France, or let's say exhibitions done on what used to be called Indochine or Indochina. The exceptions, I'd say, which has also been rather slow in happening, are perhaps exhibitions from Algeria or from Morocco, but that's mainly been sort of exhibitions undertaken by the Institute of the Arab World. So that again sort of, I suppose, places it in a specific framework. So I just want to sort of read out very briefly what the idea behind Indian Summer was, and probably throw up some questions which we can, again, which will come up perhaps in our discussion. So I mean, I was one curator in this team. There were two other people. There was Henri-Claude Cousseau, who was at the time the head of the École des Beaux-Arts, and Gianni Loga, who ran the cultural program department. Now, the institution of the École des Beaux-Arts is also important because it's not a museum. And over the years, it's had this sort of, it has been making an effort to show art being done elsewhere in the world. I mean, sometimes from Eastern Europe, but also the Far East. And so this exhibition about Indian art was very much part of that ongoing program. So it's not, we're not talking about an exhibition in a museum situation, although of course the École des Beaux-Arts has a very important collection of works of art going back from its foundation in the 17th century. So I'll just read this out because it sort of, I think, summarizes what we were trying to do. So our intention was to present a range of work in a variety of media to a public in Europe unaware of the scene in the subcontinent. And I'd insist on this because, of course, Gita very rightly brought this thing about how people are now, certainly in Europe, even in 2005, not happy about sort of what they call national surveys. But I don't think it can, I mean, given the fact that this was an art school, it made sense, and that was part of the agenda of this exhibition, to show art scenes which have not been shown before. You know? So I think purely as a pedagogical exercise also, this was obviously worthwhile. Our selection was focused on works that were formally inventive and thematically complex, that engaged with life as it is lived in India today. The exhibition itinerary was staged with a view to setting up a sequence of relays between stylistically diverse works, the more to create a space for the play and ricochet of multiple meanings and allusions. The choice of artists, there were 24, who had emerged from the 90s onwards, was also an acknowledgement of the reality of globalization, but it was precisely in those years that the Indian government decided to liberalize its trade policies, jettisoning several decades worth of adherence to a protectionist conception of the economy. Our interest lay in exploring the cultural repercussions of the so-called opening up of India to foreign investment, evinced notably in the ways in which many of the works we chose showed themselves to be unduped by the blandishments of the corporate culture into which the country was in the process of mutating. It is this mutation as spectacle, rather than the reality of the widening gulf between the rich and the poor, that is the focus of most Western media attention on India. During the 3 years that went into the preparation of the exhibition, we realized that most of the artists who had retained our attention were engaged, consciously or not, with what, from the 1990s onwards, had become some kind of critical catchword. And of course, I had hastened to add, of course, that was a passing phenomenon, but at that time it was very much a kind of critical slogan, i.e. local versus global, for reckoning with the new world order into which India had been recently catapulted. An older version of this dichotomy, or rather dialectic, namely of tradition and modernity, had, of course, long exercised preceding generations of Indian artists, but the terms in which it had been framed were intimately linked with the questions of post-colonial identity. And I'd like to, I think it's obvious that the artists who emerge in the late 90s and in 2000 onwards are not really concerned about, I think, Geeta might correct me, but they're not as engaged with questions of post-colonial identity as, of course, the early generations were. The rich historical background of the work that emerges during the 90s registers the existence of other modernities outside the hegemonic Euro-American sphere. Only when the prevalence worldwide of these multiple lineages of the modern is acknowledged will it be possible to proceed with a critical reckoning of what comes in their wake, i.e. postmodernism, and the current imperialism, ongoing imperialism that goes by the name of globalization. Now I just want to sort of very quickly say a few things about the kind of, I'm not going to talk about individual artists, of course, and of course I apologize for not showing you images, so this will be a kind of imaginary exhibition for those who didn't see it. The generation of artists that emerged in the last decade and a half is less, 2 decades now, is because 2005 was when Indian Summer happened and now in 2016, but I'm talking about what we showed and this is what it concerned them at the time. The generation of artists that emerged in the last decade and a half is less burdened by questions of the post-colonial heritage and has a rather more relaxed attitude to what their predecessors were often prone to see as a somewhat intimidating monolith of Western art. The proliferation of biennials in the Southern Hemisphere, while providing alternative platforms for exchange and exposure, has served to relativize the omnipresence of London and New York as harbingers of the new, although it is in these cities that contemporary Indian art has fetched record prices. More importantly, for many of the artists, the post-medium condition of much of contemporary art practice has sanctioned new freedoms in the reappropriation and recoding of certain formal procedures associated with movements or tendencies of the recent past, namely pop art, minimalism, and installation art. Intermedia work, in particular, has become a kind of global lingua franca, although the point that needs to be stressed is the ambition on the part of some of the more creatively astute practitioners to estrange, on the level of content, what an international audience would, at first sight, recognize in a rather facile way as something familiar, if not déjà vu, in terms of the formal language deployed. And I think this is what we were very conscious of in terms of the artists we chose and how we showed them. This is where the notion of cultural translation has an important role to play, in that something more is at stake than the usual recourse to pastiche and parody that, of course, Frederick Jameson has famously identified as the leading tropes of postmodernism. The hybrid nature of a significant number of works in the choice of materials, no less than on a symbolic or allegorical level, suggests that it is an enlarged notion of act practice that most keenly registers the cultural contradictions of the new art world, or the new world order, sorry, as well. Further, if the breach of medium specificity has provoked a proliferation of mixed media and installation work, surely not all of this can be dismissed as a manifestation of an international fashion, I quote, in which art essentially finds itself complicit with the globalization of the image in the service of capital, unquote, as Rosalind Krauss does in a recent essay. For many Indian, read non-Western artists, the expanded field of contemporary art holds out the possibility, at last, of a decolonization of art practice with the attraction of, say, installation work lying in its potential to instantiate political and poetic links between culturally disparate entities. In many cases, their work offers what Jameson has described as a striking feature of the most interesting postmodernist works, namely a more positive conception of relationship which restores its proper tension to the notion of difference itself. Difference relates is the paradoxical slogan proposed by Jameson to categorize this postmodernist experience of form. And this is, among other things, was one of the registers which we were trying to explore in Indian Summer. I'll stop there, but I just want to add that Indian Summer, one of the reviews, when I was going back to see the kind of reviews which it received in the French press, Le Monde, for example, mentioned that Indian Summer was the first exhibition of non-European art in Paris after Magicien de la Terre in 1989. and which I think I thought was, I mean, I'd forgotten about that, but which is interesting because in a way, non-European art has, the discourse on it, or the received idea about it, has been framed by that very, very problematic, and it continues to be problematic, exhibition, Magicians of the Earth. I could just end by saying, perhaps we could bring this up later on, in terms of what Hamad was suggesting about how generally the kind of reception or interest in this kind of art in France is. I'd say that Magicians of the Earth was in a way revealing of what Jean-Hubert Martin, the curator, has gone on to do, because he did an edition of the Lyon Biennale, which is called Shared Exoticisms, and this most recent exhibition, which is a kind of caprice, is a big exhibition at the Grand Palais, which is called Carambolage, which doesn't translate quite well in English, but it's basically a purely ahistorical record of overview of art, where, for example, a primitive mask is juxtaposed to Annette Messager. He dispenses entirely with any art historical or theoretical framework, and explicitly so, because Jean-Marc Martin has said that people are now bored to read about long sort of notices about, bold texts about, or theoretical frameworks about how works, in museums, etc. So what you have is a purely abstract kind of space, which is, goes back to a very old-fashioned, idea about morphological sort of affinities, and so that's one way of looking at things. So it's sort of cabinet of curiosities view of world art, which is quite strong in France, because if you see other curators, Jean de Loisy, who runs the Palais de Tokyo, for example, has done exhibitions called The Trace of the Sacred, and which, mind-boggling enough, features Marcel Duchamp. So that kind of sort of blanket category where you can put in anything and everything, and it wasn't as if it was a tongue-in-cheek thing about the sacralization of the ready-made. I can assure you. And he's gone on to do another exhibition called Simple Forms, which again talks about a certain tendency in modern art, of course, and in archaic culture, so to speak, where the forms are really sort of simplified. So talking about Brancusi, but also all kinds of things. And so that again is that this sort of trans-historical, ahistorical categories, which is very much, I think, a leading tendency, which you don't really see, I think, certainly not in Britain, as far as I'm concerned, or in the Anglo-American world, because it's sort of... and the last point I want to say as well is that 2005 was Indian Summer, but also 2005 was Africa Remix at the Pompidou Center, which of course David was instrumental in that project, curated by Simon Jamy in Paris. And that, again, when I was looking back at the kind of reviews it had, it was a beautiful and very lively show. But I think Simon Jamy says at some stage that he wanted to sort of, the catalogue is there to bring up all the issues about what is Africanness, etc., etc. But he didn't want to create a visual display where these questions would sort of, detract from the pure visual experience of looking at it. So of course that had, people who were for or against, but it was certainly a very lively show. But I just wanted to bring it up in terms of two exhibitions following from the Magicians of the Earth show happening the same year in Paris. Okay, thank you.